cells. And then there's a slippery slope. You might need a small intervention, antibiotics, or just, maybe a CAT scan. And all of a sudden, all these interventions have accumulated over several weeks at the cost of several $100,000.
Well, once again, we're talking about people who are terminal. Okay. And in that setting, treating things which are maybe easily treated, but which will kill you quickly and painlessly, I'm not sure that that's a reasonable thing to do. We can treat pneumonia, we can treat a heart attack, for example, but in those situations you pass painlessly and quickly, and we're saving them so they can die of something worse?
Wow. Cost is another issue to consider here as well.
Well, I don't tend to focus on the cost. I really am looking at the quality of life, but the cost is unbelievable. We're talking $10,000, $20,000 a day when you're in an intensive care unit, and the costs accumulate to just an unbelievable degree. They often bankrupt families. A person's estate may be completely removed.
Caregivers, as people who care, is to relieve suffering, not add to the pile. True to the tenets of palliative care, I function as something of a reflective advocate as much as a prescribing physician. Quick aside, palliative care, very important field, but poorly understood. While it is not limited to end-of-life care. It is not limited to hospice. It's simply about comfort and living well at any stage. Okay, so please know that you don't have to be dying anytime soon to benefit from palliative care. So much of what we're talking about today is a shift in perspective. After my accident, when I went back to college, I changed my major to art history. Studying visual art, I figured I'd learn something about how to see. A really potent lesson for a kid who couldn't change so much of what he was seeing. Perspective, that kind of alchemy we humans get to play with, turning anguish into a flower. Flash forward, now I work at an amazing place in San Francisco called the Zen Hospice Project, where we have a little ritual that helps with this shift in perspective. When one of our residents dies, the mortuary men come, and as we're wheeling the body out through the garden, heading for the gate, we pause. Anyone who wants. Fellow residents, family, nurses, volunteers, the hearse drivers too now. Share a story or a song or silence as we sprinkle the body with flower petals. It takes a few minutes. It's a sweet, simple parting image to usher in grief with warmth rather than repugnance. Contrast that with the typical experience in the hospital setting. Much like this, floodlit room lined with tubes and beeping machines and blinking lights that don't stop even when the patient's life has. Cleaning crew swoops in, the body's whisked away. It feels as though that person had never really existed. Well-intended, of course, in the name of sterility, but hospitals tend to assault our senses. And the most we might hope for within those walls is numbness. One of the most tried and true interventions we know of is to bake cookies. As long as we have our senses, even just one, we have at least the possibility of accessing what makes us feel human, connected. Namely, we need to lift our sights, to set our sights on well-being. So that life can become, and health care can become about making life more wonderful rather than just less horrible. Beneficence. Here, this gets right at the distinction between a disease-centered and a patient or human-centered model of care. And here is where caring becomes a creative, generative, even playful act. Play may sound like a funny word here, but it's also one of our highest forms of adaptation, consider every major compulsory effort it takes to be human. The need for food is birth cuisine. The need for shelter has given rise to architecture. The need for cover, fashion. And for being subjected to the clock, well, we invented music. So, since dying is a necessary part of life, what might we create with this fact? By play, I am in no way suggesting that we take a light approach to dying or that we mandate any particular way of dying. There are mountains of sorrow that cannot move, and one way or another, we will all kneel there. Rather, I am asking we make space, physical, psychic room, to allow life to play itself all the way out, so that rather than just getting out of the way, aging and dying can become a process of crescendo through to the end. We can't solve for death.
The real problem is that many of the patients who are being treated aggressively, if you ask them, they would prefer less aggressive care. They would prefer to be cared for at home. They'd prefer to go to hospice if they were given a choice, but we don't adequately give them a choice.
At some point, most doctors know that a patient's not likely to get better.
Absolutely.
And after you've run through all the choices, then...
Sometimes there's a good conversation. Often there's not. You know, patients are left alone to sort of figure it out themselves.
That's what Meredith Snedeker says happened to her mother. Though she received $40,000 worth of care in her last 2 months of life, not one of her 25 doctors sat down with Dorothy Glass and her family and discussed how she wanted to die. Marcia Klisch might have lingered for quite some time in the intensive care unit at Dartmouth-Hitchcock, but Dr. Byock and his team had a number of meetings with her closest friend, Barbara Menchen. She said Klisch would not want to be kept alive on machines if there was no meaningful hope of recovery. It was decided the doctors would not try to resuscitate her if her condition worsened, which it soon did.
Her heart has just flipped into a rhythm that doesn't allow it to beat effectively.
She died a few moments later.
This is a hard time in human life, but it's just a part of life. Collectively, as a culture, we really have to acknowledge that we're mortal, get over it, and start looking at what a healthy, morally robust way for people to die looks like.